Okay, I think I will start now. So welcome everyone to this third webinar in the series of 3 webinars on biodiversity that we host from the Aarhus University Circular Bioeconomy cluster, where we have been initiating a focus on biodiversity and to inspire us on how to build it into a bioeconomy setting. So my name is Morten Amby Jensen. I'm heading the center, the cluster, and I'm also an associate professor at the Department of Biological and Chemical Engineering at Aarhus University. And I will facilitate today's webinar on valorizing biodiversity in environmental settings. While you have a chance to look at today's program, I'll just highlight a few house rules for our webinars. We would like that everyone who's not speaking make sure to be muted, and it's definitely allowed with questions. It can be you can post your questions in the chat during the presentations, and we will have a look at it in parallel, and presenters who have presented can also look at specific questions addressed to their presentations when they are not presenting or after their presentation. We will also give a little bit of time between each presentation to 1, 2, 3 questions if there is someone with also you can post that with voice, so unmute and give your question. Please turn on your camera when you pose a question so we know who's talking. And otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Well, we are recording the webinar, so and the recording will be posted on our CBIO website at some point after the webinar, together with the previous 2 webinars. Okay. It's not in presentation mode. Oh, good. Like this. Okay, I'll just stop sharing. I thought someone would. Okay. Yes. Okay. Much better. Much better. Okay. Yes, as I said, we are recording the session, and the recording will be uploaded afterwards. We have a very exciting program with 4 key experts in different aspects related to biodiversity and valorization of biodiversity, or how we value and could create value from in our society on biodiversity. But to begin with, I will just give a very short introduction to the CBIO, and also why we are having this webinar series. So very shortly, CBIO is an interdisciplinary and dynamic network at Aarhus University, where we foster research and innovation, collaboration, knowledge sharing, and opportunities in novel bioeconomy value chains, also facilitating collaboration with AU and external stakeholders, industry, or society organizations, etc. And what we are concerned with is that the circular bioeconomy is very important when we're going from a fossil-based society to a fossil-free society. Here we need circular bioeconomy together with other types of renewables and bio-based resources to supply the materials and the food and the energy that we as society need. And here we have a significant industrial and societal potential, but it's also a tremendous transition and full of challenges and potential dead ends. So the task for CBIO is very much to gather as many clever minds around this topic as possible. And then I will just add on CBIO that we are in a transition from what was called an interdisciplinary center, which was supported by specific departments at Aarhus University. We are transitioning into a full AU-wide cluster and thus expanding the interdisciplinarity. It's the aim to involve researchers from all the faculties at Aarhus University, being technical science, natural science, business and social science, health science, and arts and social science. Okay. So biodiversity in the circular bioeconomy. Why did we start this webinar? If I should put some words on that, it's really that biodiversity underpins key ecosystem services that are absolutely necessary for the future bioeconomy, especially if we are, which is well also absolutely necessary, that a future bioeconomy should keep within planetary boundaries. And here I have added this figure from the planetary boundaries framework, and biosphere integrity is one of the really the boundaries that are crossed to a high extent. So we in circular bioeconomy we need food and fiber production, ecosystem resilience, nature-based solutions, climate adaptations, and a lot of this is need biodiversity to sustain. So a central question that lies behind this series is, how do we integrate biodiversity into the emerging circular bioeconomy that many of us are working on developing or investigating? And with the basic aim of increasing the knowledge base on biodiversity within our interdisciplinary network and fostering dialogue. Traditionally, there haven't been a lot of focus on biodiversity in CBIO previously as a broad sense. So this today is a third webinar in a series of three, where we have tried to put different focus, going from understanding biodiversity and also how it can be measured, also how it can be measured with new novel types of monitoring systems for invertebrates and microbes. And then we went on in the second webinar, focusing on, can biodiversity play a role in the future agricultural systems and management systems that we foster in a bioeconomy setting, both about what is the pressure that agriculture puts on biodiversity, which we learned is significant, and is there an opportunity perhaps to combine biodiversity with agriculture. We looked at indicators and a system for measuring an index for biodiversity in ecometric, and also looked at intercropping systems that have at least a little bit more biodiversity than monocropping. So today we are advancing to the third webinar, which is Valorizing biodiversity. And so the questions from our side, being not experts in biodiversity, is why is it not prioritized in practice to a larger extent, and what does it take to really get as a society that we valorize biodiversity so much that we prioritize it. So we'll hear a lot about this today. And my hope is that this series helps to steer bioeconomy research and development to genuinely benefit biodiversity, while also staying realistic about the pace and scale of that impact, and what is also needed. So today we have 4 interesting experts with 4 very interesting talks. So Marianne Sandersen will talk about economic valuation of biodiversity, what values are at play. Rasmus Ejernes will give a talk on biodiversity effects and potential benefits for humans. Helle Søndergaard will talk about biodiversity value from a business perspective. And last, Rosalind McCann will talk about fostering environmental behaviors among agriculturalist strategies from the social science. There's a larger description of each talk in the invitation to this webinar. I just put a few highlights on what the talks might touch upon. Yeah, and I think it's better that the presenters themselves give the presentation than I try to guess. Okay, this was the introduction from my side. So from the Circular Bioeconomy Cluster at Aarhus University, we appreciate that you participate. And if you're more interested in what we do and want to collaborate, you can join us on the homepage. All right, but with no further ado, I would welcome Marianne Sandersen, Professor at Department of Environmental Science at Aarhus University, to start your presentation.
Yes,
and I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Morten. Share my screen. Yeah, I hope you can all see it. Otherwise, give a shout.
It looks good.
Just give a thumbs up or down, or speak out if I go over time. I don't hope so. But good morning, everybody. I'm a professor in environmental economics, and I've worked many years on the valuation of especially ecosystem services, tightly linked to the whole thing about biodiversity. So I want to talk about what values are at play, and how do environmental economists look at it. And of course, environmental economics doesn't cover the full scope of the values that humanity has for biodiversity. So this is one angle to this topic. This gets to work. So I want to start with ecosystem services and biodiversity. What are they? And I know that Rasmus Ejernes will come into that far more. So this is from just very briefly to start this off. So biological diversity, according to the Convention on Biological Diversity, means the variability among living organisms from all sources, be they terrestrial, marine, or other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes that they are part of. And that includes both diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. And that biological diversity allows for a lot of ecosystem services being produced by nature for the benefit of nature and humans as part of nature. And here to the right, you see a figure that is based on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that came out 20 years ago, that for the first time really put this into a framing of supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural ecosystem services. So at that time, 20 years ago, biodiversity was put under as the supporting, but biodiversity is also this maintaining and ensuring that, for instance, soil formation or photosynthesis actually occur. Then we have provisioning services in terms of water, food, medicine, and raw materials, and this is really where the bioeconomy is operating within that sphere, but dependent on these supporting functions. But through the ecosystems that we manage and preserve and restore, we also obtain regulating services. We can protect ourselves against floods using nature-based solutions. We can regulate climate, microclimates, for instance, urban heat islands. We can use nature-based solutions to cleanse water and the air. And pollination services, which again play into the provisioning. So these, of course, very much relate to each other. And that's the more social side of it in terms of what we coin the cultural services, the aesthetic, spirituality, recreation, and education. And since 20 years ago, there's been international classification of ecosystem services, and they have this grouping a bit differently. So they've got regulation and maintenance together as one group. That is transformation of biochemical or physical inputs to ecosystems, like reducing nutrient loads, or it's regulating baseline flows and extreme events, like erosion control. It is about regulating physical, chemical, and biological conditions like soil quality or pest and disease control. And then the KAISES framework also operates with provisioning, with a distinction between biotic, the biomass and the genetic material, and the abiotic, water, mineral, and non-mineral substances. And also the cultural is a separate classification under KAISES, as in this Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, looking at the physical and experimental interaction with the natural environment. And that also covers intellectual and interactions with natural environment, as we say here, and spiritual, symbolic, and other cultural interactions. So basically, nature is part of us. We are part of nature, and we thrive from it. We depend on it, but we also impact it negatively, and ultimately reducing our own opportunities for living. And another thing that is very central for environmental economics to think about when we think about ecosystem services and the supporting functions of biodiversity is the cascade model from Poching and Haynes and Young, where it works looking at how we actually interact and use and enjoy ecosystem services. And so it starts with the supporting or intermediate services, that those are the underpinning elements that ultimately determine the capacity of the ecosystem to deliver a particular service. And so that includes structures, processes, and functions. And so they can be coined as measures of ecosystem conditions. So here in this framing, it's called supporting or intermediate services. Then they lead to the ability for nature to generate final services, and they are defined as the contributions of the ecosystems to human well-being. And they are final in that they can be seen as outputs from ecosystems, whether they are natural, semi-natural, or highly modified, like agricultural land, that most directly affect the well-being of people. Then comes what we call the boundary productions. These ecosystem services give rise to goods and benefits that we humans enjoy and depend on. And the fundamental characteristic here is that they retain a connection to the underlying ecosystem functions in the beginning of this process and the structures that generate them. So that's where biodiversity as the underlying supporting function has a direct link, but through the final services to the goods and benefits that we as a society enjoy. So if we, for instance, take an example of wood used for timber, So that would include the attributes that make the particular wood material workable, like, say, a building material. That could include things like how hard it is, how strong it is, how durable the wood fiber is. And these attributes, they all depend on the underlying structural properties of the ecosystem. And that includes then tree composition, soil type, nutrient status, and the growth processes that have shaped the stand being used for wood. And the volume timber ready to be cut is then taken to be the final ecosystem service. So these services in the cascade, they give rise to these goods and benefits, and that is then where it crosses the production boundary. And it's essentially regarded as the same kind of thing in the cascade model, whether they are goods, benefits, or services. But they are one step removed from the ecosystem, and they are the things that ultimately have value to people. And that is what, from an environmental economic perspective, we work to assess in monetary terms the benefits. And that gives rise to a measure of the value, oftentimes as a willingness to pay, for instance, for woodland protection or for harvestable products. Sometimes these goods, services are also are very tangible, like here the wood harvested or the food produced, but they can also very much be non-tangible, like very much in the cultural services. So it could be listening to bird songs, the mental health impacts of having a stimulating natural environment that doesn't overstimulate. So when thinking about an ecosystem service being intermediate or final, it really depends on the beneficiary. It's a bit cryptic here, but if you take, for instance, water in a lake that is used directly for a source of drinking water, like in Sweden, not in Denmark, then that could be regarded as a final service. But if you have recreational fishery, then staying aboard that lake, that experience is the final service, whereas the clean water is the supporting intermediate service for the recreational fisheries. So from an economic perspective, it really depends on the beneficiary, what are coined as final services. So one ecosystem provides both or different types of final services to different realms of our society. So now I want to talk about what values are we thinking about. And what is really important is the IPBES values assessment that came out in 22, where they look across our societies from across the world. What are the value indicators, specific values, the broad values? What are the worldviews and knowledge systems? And they have identified a number of lenses that are really very, very clear. Although, of course, as a human being, we can move between those lenses. But one, for instance, is living from. So that's really thinking about river resources or the wood resources. So that's very, living from is very much where the bioeconomy is situated. Living in is also very much an anthropocentric worldview. Is where we have very much, we belong to this landscape. It means something to my identity, to our health. Living with riverine species and habitats, that's very much more about stewardship and responsibility, moreover in an ecocentric worldview. And living as many indigenous cultures have the river as part of their family system, the sense of oneness and harmony with nature. So fish, for instance, are perceived as cohabitants, or fish are part of kinship or clan relationship. So you can see that the value systems are very broad. So it's very clear, or very good to realize when we talk about values for biodiversity, is to realize along what lens are we thinking. And what is interesting here, you see on the right, these specific values, instrumental, intrinsic, or relational. And so these instrumental fits very nicely into the bioeconomy perspective. It's a means to an end. A nature is a resource and an asset. that satisfies our needs and preferences, and it's useful for people immediately. The intrinsic values are really gives an agency to rivers, to species, inherently a worth of biodiversity that goes beyond what we need and what we want. The relational is the importance of what is desirable, what gives meaning to us. And it's very much about reciprocal human relationships. So within that, the values I'm going to talk about are the ones that are very much instrumental, partly relational, not intrinsic, but I'll come back to that. So we operate, so here you can see on the right, living from and living in. Environmental economists, we work very much with what we call the total economic value. So we look at ecosystem services that you can get benefits through use values and non-use values. Direct use values relate to the benefits that we derive directly from the use of environmental or natural resources, either as part of a production process of food, groundwater, or through direct use like recreational use. The indirect use values relate to very much the regulatory ecosystem services we talked about before. So climate regulation, flood control, indirect health benefits resulting from improved air quality, for instance, in cities. The option values among the use values are the opportunity that we can have that in future. So we don't want to take away what we might want in the future as well. And then we come over to what we call the non-use values, very much the non-tangible values. And in relation to specifically valuation of biodiversity, the non-use values tend to outweigh the values that we place from a use value perspective. So that's quite interesting. For instance, existence value, knowing that ecosystems exist and preserved, even if you don't go and visit, knowing that is a very prominent value in this setting. Altruistic values, knowing that others can enjoy this, even if I don't get my own share of it. Bequest values, it's really this thing of thinking intergenerational, that future generations should have at least, if not better, one would hope, environment than today. So the total economic value is really an estimate of the benefits arising from the ecosystem services. As you can see, all these values are based on this anthropocentric worldview that we humans assign a value on nature. So it's not the intrinsic value of nature, which of course is also there, and the others that I talked, the relational ones, especially. But these are one way of trying to quantify the value of biodiversity that can be included into decision-making processes more readily. Then we have different approaches to estimate the value of ecosystem services. So the beginning of this is what you saw before. Now there's a layer below. So there are different approaches, market-based approaches. We're looking at price and cost functions, looking at alternative costs. That has been done quite a lot also in biodiversity. What does it actually cost to preserve and restore nature? And that is then used as the value of biodiversity. You could say, we actually do the same thing for our public health system. We don't value the public health system for the benefits it gives us, but for the value that or the cost that it costs us to do. That's kind of how we politically assign a value to our health system. So it's a bit the same approach here, using alternative costs. You can also use damage costs. What would it cost to agriculture to lose pollination services? Restoration costs, a bit the same as here in terms of alternative costs. Dose response is where we really also integrate, if there's a change, what response will that have and what is the impact? We also have indirect methods, reveal preferences, and that is indirect methods that seek to estimate the public's valuation of a natural asset based on observed demand, for instance, for a home. How far are people willing to travel, or how much are they willing to pay more for the home being close to nature? We also have the stated preferences, which are direct methods to reveal people's preferences and the value that they place on natural resources. And that is done through structured interviews and experiments. And so those are hypothetical, and they are the only methods that you can capture the non-use values, because you can't really observe non-use values. That would be through revealed preferences, if you like. So these stated preferences can be used for both use values and non-use values, but none of the others can be applied for these non-use values. And what I said before is that within biodiversity, these non-use values actually prove to be very significant. So the monetary valuation, when we look at specifically at biodiversity, in terms of the direct use values, it's the current or future potential to experience more biodiversity in nature, including more and rare species. So that's how it's being used in environmental economics to assess the direct use values of biodiversity. When we talk about indirect use values, it relates to when biodiversity underpins an ecosystem service, such as soil formation. And then the non-use values, it's the knowledge that species exist or that nature is doing well, and that we can maintain such a condition for future generations. So those are the typical framings that are used in monetarily assessing the value of biodiversity. Just a disclaimer, if I didn't say that clearly before, of course, biodiversity forms the basis of all life. And so the value of all biodiversity is ultimately endless. So what I'm talking about is not valuing a biodiversity per se. The monetary valuation of biodiversity is only assessed in relation to the actual nature restoration scenarios or plans. And these typically only impact biodiversity marginally. So that's kind of the scope of what these techniques can do. So oftentimes I think it's being a bit misunderstood what these approaches can do, but they are marginal, and they are based on really the context and the specific scenario. So here to the last part of my talk, I'll just give some examples of monetary valuation of biodiversity in Denmark. I think that can give a bit of a flavor for how these stated preference methods, especially how they have framed and what results they have reached. There's of course a lot more to say about this, but limited time. So for instance, one thing here is one of the first studies in Denmark by Skov et al. From 2003. They looked at pesticide-free buffer zones to promote biodiversity, and they used a contingent valuation method. And so the scenario set up was a 10% increase in the survival rate of partridge chicks. And that was found to be valued of, at the time in 2003, in 245 kroner per year for an average household. And if you scale that up to the national population, back then in 2003, that was a value of about a bit more than 500 million kroner per year, just for that aspect. If we look, for instance, at biodiversity in lakes and streams, Beat Hasler et al., also about 20 years ago, did our first and so far only groundwater quality value assessment. And as part of this choice experiment that was done here, it was also that a cleaner groundwater impacts also lakes and streams, and in turn plants and animals in lakes and water courses. And so the scenario was to, through the cleaner groundwater, that biodiversity in lakes and watercourses would move from less good to very good. And here was a very high willingness to pay per household per year for the biodiversity component alone of 1,200 krona back in 2005. If we look at biodiversity and heritage, so this groundwater was a national one. These studies can also be done for specific areas like Stora Åmose, and that was a study by Lundhed and Thorsen and Hansen back in 5 and 7, looking at the protection of biodiversity and heritage. And so that was a scenario, a choice experiment, where it was about improvement from poor biodiversity to good biodiversity with many ordinary and rare species, especially birds. And the studies did the same, it's based on the same data, but the second, Thorsen and Hansen did a different method with the data. So it ranged between 300 and 500 krona per year per household back in 5 and 7. Looking at heath, there was a study by Boysen on valuing Danish heath and associated endemic species. And here, interesting, it's to get a kind of a value assessment of the willingness to pay per species per year for securing the survival of up to 25 endemic species. And that was at the time 10 krona. But for some species, the more exact that they were explained and rare, values went up to 300 krona per species. And generally also the more rare, the higher the value rather than the less or the more ordinary species. There's also an assessment of the willingness to pay for habitat protection for 10,000 hectares of heath to 25 krona per household per year. This is the second last I'll show. This is on forest by Campbell in 14, looking at different forms of biodiversity in forests in eastern Denmark. And here it was looking at, in a choice experiment, a willingness to pay for securing the survival of either 50 or 100 species that would otherwise go extinct. And the result was between 1,100 and 2,000 krona. There was also an assessment not only on the species, but on the natural processes to improve those, going from a very little deadwood, for instance, to a very high degree of untouched forest areas, and a number of trees per hectare left for natural processes. And that was a value that ranged between 600 and 850 krona per household per year, from medium to high protection level. Across landscapes, what we can say is that there's a general willingness to pay for ensuring the survival of threatened species across landscape, broadleaf forest, heath, fields, meadows, lakes, and streams. And they actually come at around the same level of 30 krona per species per year per household in 22 values. In general, the willingness to pay to increase biodiversity is very high, but when we talk about not threatened species, the willingness to pay is significantly lower. And these values, for instance, have been used in green accounting to look at the exchange value of the cost of losing biodiversity, or the cost of losing species. And that's a study from Jacobsen and Lundhed in 24. So just to conclude, the value of biodiversity preservation is predominantly based on non-use values, and they are significant. But we need to keep in mind that these values captured are part of a specific worldview system. They are partial in nature, and they are conditioned on this condition or the situation today. But that means that when we talk about tipping points, we don't know what the system will look at the other player on the other side. So these methods cannot assess biodiversity values in the case of tipping points. So that really is about addressing we have issues in environmental economics of address the systemic uncertainty that we have. And we also we don't know these values beyond an unknown threshold due to insufficient understanding of dependencies. So it also calls for caution and really being careful of not going to the edge. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for this tour de force in approaches to address and evaluate economically the biodiversity, together with other ecosystem services, or maybe how it interplays with other ecosystem services, and good examples. I think we have just a few minutes for a few questions. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or post it in the chat. I was thinking, just to start a little bit, when the unit per household, is that the households that are in the proximity of the area, in these examples you made, is that within that area, a distance of something, or is it the entire population or all households in Denmark, for example, or how is that understood?
So some of these studies have a sampling that is in the vicinity of the areas. Others have a national focus. And what generally is shown across the studies that we also have values for the biodiversity in Thy National Park, even if we don't go up there. So that's definitely a case that these values are not per household just around the border of that area. But there's also studies done comparing, for instance, improvement of biodiversity projects in Denmark and Sweden, that when we do those projects here in Denmark, we have a higher value for that than if they are done in Sweden. So there's some national distance decay, so to speak. So there's some sign of it, but generally, because these are the non-use values that come through so much, it's not that distance dependent within boundaries.
Yeah. Interesting. I think when you say that there is a difference in Denmark compared to Sweden, I guess there could be something to do with that you have more nature in Sweden, sorry. And the baseline could be different, or is that true, or is
what
it
I
just
meant is that both in Sweden and in Denmark, the populations, they value biodiversity projects less in the neighboring country than in their own country. Okay. That was what. But in terms of the level of willingness to pay, I know from studies that look, for instance, at the improvement of the water quality in the Baltic Sea, that Denmark tend to have a lower average willingness to pay per household than in Sweden or Finland, or even in some of the Baltic countries. And that is, my speculation is that when those studies were done, at least, we did not have as big a knowledge and awareness in the population about it. It's far more communicated, for instance, in Sweden to the general public than, but of course, in the recent years, the problems have become so dire in Denmark that everybody hears about it. But that was not the case like 10 years ago. People didn't really think about it in Denmark, or the awareness wasn't as high. And these valuation, I should say also, they are snapshots in time. These values, they change over time. The determinants of willingness to pay may change over time. Society evolves and our values evolve. So we should always be careful when we kind of transfer just by adjusting for price developments from 20 years ago to today. It could be that the determinants are quite changed. So it's important to also repeat these studies in general.
Thank you. That makes sense. Other question? Maybe we have time for one more. Otherwise, I'll just... Anders? you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Marianne. You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a
We can
kind of
hear you.
echo here, but anyway, when you make this willingness to pay surveys, are people, are they informed beforehand about the roles of for example, specific species, how they contribute to ecosystem services?
Not necessarily a link here to ecosystem services. So this is really about the value to protect species from going extinct, these studies I've shown here. So it's really about this almost moral values that we have, that we cannot afford to get a more poor biological diverse country. So these are really the non-use values that are related to that. Those were the ones I wanted to focus on here. And that's when we go on to really value ecosystem services, that's really important. But the link between increased biodiversity and the increased robustness, resilience, deliverance of ecosystem services, I would argue that we don't have that actually at an experimental case or exact numbers. These dependencies are not robust enough that we can use those. It is maybe that could be a discussion for later in this webinar, but that this link between biodiversity and ecosystem services are very conceptual, I would argue. But Rasmus, you may very much argue against me, because we could potentially just continue having agriculture without using soil. I mean, they use that in greenhouses and in the Netherlands, for instance. But we have all these problems of the negative externalities of how we do agriculture or forestry that then reduce the ecosystem services for others. So they are far more easy to value than actually put the value on the link between biodiversity and the deliverance of ecosystem services.
Thank you, Marianne, and that's probably also a good segue to the next presentation. So Rasmus Ejernes will talk on biodiversity effects and potential benefits for humans. Rasmus is professor at Department of Ecoscience, Aarhus University, and also speaking into, I think you would really increase our knowledge base and perhaps also create a better baseline for answering some of these surveys, giving what the value of biodiversity and what is actually possible. I hope you will also say something about protection versus production landscapes, etc. So please share your slides, Rasmus, and take the word.
Yes, I will. If you stop sharing. Let me see. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it works, and it is in presentation mode.
Good. So I will be touching upon the use values particularly, but also other benefits to humans. And I'm not an economist, but I'll try to make it relevant nevertheless, and I'll try also to provide some natural history knowledge into the discussion about biodiversity, as it is about natural ecosystems and real species out there. So last year I had the chance to visit a rainforest. That was in high time before I get retired. So I visited this and I took this picture. And that's just amazing. It's the Amazonian rainforest taken from the foothills of the Andes. And this is from, I visited Ecuador, so you can see the Andes Mountains as a running from north to south there. And to the right, or the east, you have the Amazonian rainforest, and to the left, the Pacific Ocean. And And as you notice, there are some dark green areas and there's some light green areas. And let's just zoom in on some of these light green areas. And what we see is that I've zoomed in here. There's an opportunity to have a meal, I can see. But otherwise, there are some forest clearings going on here, obviously in small quadrats. And I was told by Asser Ølgaard, who was our host on the trip from Randers Regnskov. We visited their nature reserve. Actually, it's owned by an Ecuadorian fund, but it was acquired by Randers Regnskov. And they told me that what happens is that if you have a road, then all the landowners, they suddenly get access to their small piece of rainforest. And what they do then is that they typically use the road to clear their lots for trees and then have some sort of subsistence farming. So a few cattle and some poultry and other stuff that could provide ecosystem services to their family. So this is an image of ecosystem services taking place along the roads for humans, as opposed to this vast rainforest of very little use to humans or to the landowners. So actually, as Ølgaard explained us, that the most effective way of protecting the forests biodiversity was to avoid or to block the building of roads so that people could not access their ecosystem services easily. Now we could take this further into Denmark. So this is a piece of Denmark pretty close to where I live. There you have a very intensively used, but it's also small lots here. It's also farmers, and they're using the area quite more intensively than in the rainforest. And they also produce a lot more food per hectare. Most of the food is put into pigs, but nevertheless, it is a highly production-intensive landscape and has been so for very long. Denmark is one of the most intensively cultivated landscapes, and still, I don't see any ecosystem collapse here. I see a lot of biodiversity loss, but no collapse. Now, you could imagine that you would claim that biodiversity was really important, so you could add some biodiversity to this landscape and have better production or ecosystem services, but it seems to work exactly oppositely. So if you want to make a permanent set aside of these intensive fields, then it's not a benefit to the landowner. The landowner needs a compensation to do it. So it's not, biodiversity here is not an investment, it's a cost. So in this case, 11,000 hectares was permanently set aside in 2024 in Denmark, and that was at the cost of 777 million Danish kroner. So restoring biodiversity in an intensively cultivated landscape is doesn't give a surplus, at least not to the owner. It's a cost, and the owner needs to be compensated. So there's a reason for this. This is a picture that I took also from close to here at the Glatved Strand in eastern Jutland. This is biodiversity. This is one of the rare plants in Denmark called plettet kongepind, Hypocoeris maculata, and it has been common just 100 years ago, and it's one of the plants that has declined the most in Denmark, and that's because it requires infertile soil. You can see the soil is pretty infertile, almost nothing is growing here. So there's plenty of light to these leaves sitting close to the ground. And there is a large population of not only this rare plant, but also a lot of other rare plants that are not really thriving in the Danish landscape today. Here plants are thriving. This is soil health. This is fertile. This is productive. This is wonderful. This is ecosystem services. That's also a crop in eastern Jutland, a wheat crop, and that gives us food on the table, as opposed to the other picture. But it's also a complete eradication of all species that you could consider sensitive or vulnerable or threatened in Denmark today. They will not have a habitat here. but it still works. So there's perfect use value and functioning in the ecosystem. There's just not space for sensitive species. So this is for humans, and the other image, that's for the other species. This is a biodiversity map that we produced of Denmark, and you can see how the biodiversity distributes in the landscape. That's the the areas of high conservation value. That's the yellow and red areas, and the white areas, that's the intensive fields where we get our use value from the ecosystems, where we have the agriculture. And now I put all the observations of red-listed species in the last 20 years onto the landscape. They were found here. So almost no findings of these species in the cultivated landscape. They just don't have a habitat there. They cannot make a living there. Whereas in the dune landscapes, in some of the forests, along the coast, in the grasslands, in the wetlands, that's where you find the rare species, the sensitive species, the red-listed species in Denmark. So this is an image of how natural ecosystems would look like in Denmark and in the rest of temperate Europe. And this is based on empirical evidence from paleoecology. So yes, you might, maybe you didn't know, but we would have elephants, not only in ice ages, but also in interglacials like the one we are in today. We would have rhinos, we would have white horses, aurochs, wild boar, etc. So the large animals is one of the striking aspects of this landscape. And the other striking aspect is that, what would you call this? What's the ecosystem? What would you call the ecosystem? It's really, is it a forest? Is it a grassland? Is it a wetland? What is it? So what we call it as biologists is a grassland forest mosaic. And that's what the pollen analyses and that's what the paleoecological data point at, is that there would be a mixture of trees, old trees, large animals, and open grassland and intermixed with the trees. So it's really, I wouldn't consider it messy, but at least it doesn't fit the categories in our current landscape. Now, of course, in Denmark it looks a bit different. So, for instance, like this could be a national park, a forest in a national park, a state-owned forest in a national park. And why does this look so dark as compared to this baseline for our ecosystem? Well, that's because in 1805, clever people realized that if we were going to extract timber from Danish forests, we need to get rid of the animals, because all the herbivores, all the horses and cattle from the agriculture, destroying the growing trees, which you can see also in the reconstruction of natural ecosystems, that animals destroy trees. So you have nice, open, sunny places with a lot of habitat for rare species. So they got rid of all the grazing animals, and then they started planting trees in all the forest glades and all the openings and meadows inside the forests. And what happened? This is the butterflies of Denmark. And all these species went extinct over the past 200 years after they removed all the grazing in Danish forests. And they were not killed by pesticides or by fertilizers or by humans. They were killed by shade. So shade killed these butterflies, and they are no longer to be seen in Denmark. And actually they are threatened in most of Europe, because almost the same happened all over Europe, that people realized that they needed to remove the grazing animals from the forests in order to have timber. And therefore, we have seen a very steep decline in biodiversity in European forests. Last year, we also went on an expedition to try to find sort of the last remnants of real species-rich ecosystems in Europe. And we went to Romania and Czech Republic and Poland, and this picture is from Romania. And it is very species-rich, and you can argue here, maybe this is the only example I can come up with of land sharing. So obviously these cattle grazing here, they are not rewilded and wild, they are kept cattle. So somebody is going to use their meat and maybe even milk some of them. But you might also realize that this is not effective farming. This is remnant of some old socialist, Soviet Russian collective farming that hasn't been modernized since the Russians left, and it's going to change, that's for sure, because the soils below this very species-rich grasslands, they are fertile chanostems like the one in Ukraine. They could really give some crops of wheat, I can tell you. And in other parts of Romania, also from the same trip, it starts looking like this. So dark forests without grazing animals, and the grassland slowly turning into farmland with crop cultivation and reseeding and immense loss of biodiversity, but increase of use value, obviously. If you continue to Denmark, you can see that the idea of land sharing is quite corrupted. This is intensive summer grazing, and when you have intensive summer grazing, it doesn't look anywhere like the natural ecosystem that I showed you before. It looks like this. So these cattle has been eating all the flowers that should be there for butterflies or for grasshoppers or for all the insects living from and by plants. Also wild bees that need flowers. There is not a flower here because the animals have just eaten everything. And this is probably subsidized by some agricultural subsidies for biodiversity conservation, but it's clearly misunderstood, because this is just intensive farming and quite detrimental to biodiversity. So there might be a case of possible land sharing with cattle grazing or horse grazing, where you could actually use the cattle for beef production, but it would require some very strict rules about how to do it, because in natural ecosystems, you have whole year-round grazing at natural densities, and this is clearly overgrazing and not beneficial to biodiversity. But can't we come up with some examples that we need biodiversity? Bees and pollination, for example. Well, first, most of our crops are not pollinated. They are wind pollinated, so not pollinated by insects. Second, those that are, when you have a field of a crop, you need a lot of insects for pollination. And therefore, what you really need to collaborate with is the common bees, not all the rare bees. They have too small populations to be of any use in the pollination of a crop. So you need really common bees. So it could be the domestic honeybee, or it could be maybe one or two or three of the 10 most common bees in Denmark. But we have 290 species of wild bees in Denmark, and most of them are just plainly useless. So we don't need them. So please beware here that, of course, we need nature. This is trivial, but we don't need biodiversity. We don't need all the rare species, and they don't need us. And when we exploit ecosystems, we will destroy the habitats for the rare species. And then, of course, we can have some nature-based solution and collaboration with the common species that would be beneficial to them and beneficial to us. But at the end of the day, we would lose the rare species. What about carbon storage? Well, it is true that natural ecosystems store carbon, but it is also true that you could find more effective ways of mitigating the climate change. Solar panels, fast-growing spruce plantations. So, I mean, it doesn't give a justification of the preservation of biodiversity that we need carbon storage. You need to find another reason to preserve biodiversity. What about flooding control? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look, because we also did a bit of work on that. Let's see here if I can remove this one. This is can you see this? I changed to this landscape. Good.
Yes, so it works.
Okay, so this is the Danish nature indicator that we developed in 21, and this shows the areas that would be naturally flooded by the sea. So that's flooding, and this is not the case today. So these are the areas that are actually flooded by the sea, and the difference between the two is not biodiversity. The difference is human-built dikes, human-built coastal protections. The way we protect ourselves against flooding by the sea is not by conserving biodiversity, sorry to say, is by building dikes. Let's have a look on hydrology. This is for the same part of Jutland. These are the naturally wet areas in Denmark. So these are the inundated low-lying areas that would be wetlands naturally. And the situation today is that this is what is left of the wetlands. And the reason that this is left is not biodiversity. So it's not biodiversity that helps us against flooding. It's drainage pipes and channels and pumps. And so it's engineering work that prevents flooding. It's not biodiversity, sorry to say. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. So just to return to one of my major point here, this is the estimated price of protecting nature in Denmark from the Danish Nature Foundation, 12 kroner per square meter. That's the cost. If you want to conserve biodiversity, it's a cost, and the cost is approximately 12 kroner per square meter, which amounts to 100 billion kroner if you want to protect 20% of the Danish landscape. And of course, we could do that, but there will be a choice, and we shouldn't choose that because we want use value. I would rather rely on engineers and farmers and foresters and doctors for the use values, and then keep the biodiversity for something else. Right, I'm almost there. So back to the Amazonian rainforest. I had a morning meditation that was really wonderful. So I would say it has eternal value, absolutely. Marianne also mentioned this. It doesn't come with a purpose. It doesn't come with a necessity. That's just, you know, we humans would like that everything is about us. But this is the thing that is not about us. And our use value doesn't depend on biodiversity, but our use value is, and our exploitation of natural ecosystem is the direct cause of biodiversity loss. That's the way causality works with biodiversity. There's no obvious profit to get here, there are only costs. And those costs come with have a size and a quantity that they cannot be covered by private persons, and they will not be covered because somebody finds it beneficial. They are so large that they need to be covered by states and private funds, basically. And they're going to do it for philanthropic reasons, or because it's also the responsibility of the state to provide a good environment for its citizens. So that's I think my final slides. And I've catched up almost with the lack of the time delay.
Thank you very much.
That's great.
You did a perfectly well articulated reality check on the biodiversity and the value and the necessity. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and you catched on time. Thank you so much.
There is a question in the chat that I'd like to respond to.
There's a question in the chat. Yes. So, Rosalind, will you perhaps just mention it, or?
I can mention it. Rosalind could also.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rosalind writes, I'm surprised to hear about the pollination efficiency of native bees versus honeybees. And she mentions that some of the wild bees, such as mason bees, have a very high success rate, visiting far more flowers per minute than honeybees. And she imagines that Danish native bees could do something equivalent, and she's completely correct. So it has been shown, I think, repeatedly that honeybees are a bit sloppy with pollination, actually, and they're not only sloppy, but they also compete with native bees. So they may sometimes even be a threat to biodiversity to have these domestic honeybees. So it can be beneficial if you want pollination that you remove honeybees and you start collaborating with the native bees. The only thing here is that you need common native bees. You need some of the bees that are numerous, sufficiently numerous to actually give the service to your crop. And this is not going to be the rare and threatened bees. So of the 219 Danish wild bees, we would need maybe the 10, 15 most common bees. That would be the the bees potentially contributing importantly to my strawberry crop or my apple crop or something in the garden, and that would work. So it would make sense to collaborate with those, but it's not going to save the species that are currently listed as threatened or endangered or vulnerable on the Danish red list of bees, because what they require is some heathlands and some grasslands with some very specific species of plants, because they are highly specialized to pollinating just these plants, and there's no crop in those plants, so there's no benefit for me in growing those wild plants, except for the intrinsic value or the recreational value of having a wild garden.
Thank you, Rasmus. I think, if you have further questions, put them in the chat for time reasons. We will continue, and then we'll catch up a little bit on a broader discussion. That would be very good. So the next talk will be about the biodiversity value from business perspective. So even though that we now learn from Rasmus that biodiversity has no value to our production system, perhaps companies and businesses can see a value in supporting it and paying some of this cost that biodiversity could have. So Helle Søndergaard, Associate Professor at Department of Management at Business and Social Science, Aarhus University. Please share your screen and give your presentation.
Yes, I will just see. Are you seeing the presentation now? Yes, I think you are.
It works.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I mean, I have to admit that I did call it something with value because that was the whole idea of the webinar. And what I've done is I've put it into a business perspective because, of course, I hope it's totally clear for all of you that saw Marianne's presentation that from a company perspective, it's really the instrumental value that I will kind of talk about. That's how businesses see biodiversity, and in a way you can say what they're doing is they're saying, even though that Rasmus says, well, there's not going to be a lot of risk, but they are looking at this kind of from a risk mitigation perspective. So how will biodiversity issues in the future, how will that be a risk for us as companies, and how can we mitigate that? But I'd like to start by just talking a little bit about, what this is from a business perspective, and I just kind of wanted to present it a little bit. So my research has been primarily within innovation studies, so innovation management. So I've looked at how companies use external knowledge for innovation and innovation strategy, and then I've recently became interested in what we would call corporate biodiversity strategy. So how will biodiversity be integrated into corporate strategy? And ultimately, that's a big question mark, will it result in innovation? So that's my kind of primary interest in looking into the topic of biodiversity. Also because there's been quite a big focus on from the EU on reporting, that companies have to start reporting on how they impact biodiversity. So what we did at Aarhus University is we started a small network on bridging biology and business, because we thought that's needed in order to understand business and biodiversity at the same time. So we come from many different places. It's an IS network from the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies. I think that's the IS. So that's where we kind of have been getting together. But then we can say, and I've talked a lot with some of my, you could say, colleagues from biology and also from ecoscience. Rasmus also has a colleague who participates. So why are companies not yet implementing biodiversity protection?
and conservation measures. I mean, why haven't they just started right away? Because they must understand that this is important. And then what we looked at specifically from the management department was, I mean, these businesses or businesses in general are embedded in what we would call a hierarchy of nested paradoxes. And I'll explain what that means. And these nested paradoxes mean that outcomes at a higher level of paradoxes, they constrain the businesses or the companies at a lower level of paradoxes. And just to explain what this paradox theory and why we chose to look at it from this framing, a paradox means that you have these two oppositional demands, and you would think of it as an either-or solution. So either we do business or we protect biodiversity, and that's more or less what Rasmus is also telling us. I mean, come on. Nature is dependent on us. We don't necessarily depend on it to such a large degree. But if we look at it from a paradox perspective, this tension will never be resolved if only one of them is addressed. So that will just result in conflict. So it's not really an either or, it has to be a both and approach. So that's a paradox, and that's something that we use also within organizational research. And what we found out looking into it is really these, you could say, paradoxes that businesses are in. So you'd say that the business environment level, so these are the higher level paradoxes. There's a policy paradox and an industry paradox, and I'll give some examples of what this means. So for example, you have the policy paradox. There has been a lot of focus on sustainable development goals, EU reporting guidelines. You might have heard about the new reporting guidelines for biodiversity and nature. And when we started with climate, but what we really wanted to do is also go on the biodiversity. And they call it the CSRD. So, but then there's this paradox, because do we want economic growth or do we want green transition? And we have experienced recently within the EU that what they call the omnibus, which has kind of played down the focus and the requirements for reporting on, for example, biodiversity. So what do we want? I mean, you can also say that the political situation, the economic situation is calling for more economic growth. We need to take care of ourselves. We can't really think so much about green transition. So at the policy level, there is this kind of paradox saying, well, what do we want? We would like both economic growth and green transition. So let's see. So I'll go through these at least different paradoxes, not necessarily one by one, but two by two, so we can get some. And I'll start with the top ones. And as I was saying, just as an example on these sustainability development goals, we have the number 8, which says we want decent work and economic growth. That's of course because we think about more than nature, but we'd also like life on land. But we can't necessarily, the way we're doing it today, get both. And I know that maybe it's the idea of this cluster to say, so how can we go forward on both sides? But that's not necessarily as possible in the way that we're doing it today. But then we also have local examples. There's the agricultural CO2 acts on livestock farming, and of course the agricultural sector are saying, well, it's going to kill us. I mean, we're going to go out of business if we want to do that. So what do we want? Do we want economic growth or do we want green transition? So that's a paradox where if we want to have both, we need to think about them both at the same time. And then we also say that's at the policy level. At the industry level, there's also a paradox which you could call competition versus collaboration. I mean, we could look at it as an example where you'd say, well, this is actually collaboration. The Danish example of the Dansk Retursystem, where we give back our glass bottles. So that's something that the Danish breweries decided on together, right? So that's an example of collaboration instead of competing on it. But mostly companies would say, well, we want competition because we want to win this competition. And if we then, so that's kind of at the top level where businesses or companies are experiencing these paradoxes. So they're put into the world to make sure that we have some economic growth. Of course, we can argue or we can disagree that that should be the aim of businesses, and some scholars have also started to doing that. We know there's a lot of degrowth discussions, but at least the bulk of companies think that what they should be doing is some secure economic growth for people and countries and so on. And then there's the competition versus collaboration. Well, we'll probably end up being out of competition if we don't think about that. Okay, so that was the two first, where you can say the key obstacle there is really competitiveness. If we look at then at the firm level, where we say, okay, so what's at the firm level, what are the issues that firms are looking into? Well, there we can talk about two different paradoxes, one at the, you could say, corporate strategy level, and one at the sustainability strategy level. And I'll give some explanation to those as well. So at the corporate strategy level, we really have, I mean, businesses have a lot of stakeholders. I mean, there are shareholders, if they have shareholders, if they're not just privately owned, but then you still have also, you'd say if they're family owned, there's still some shareholders there. You have banks that are stakeholders. They want, they will lend money to the companies, but they will also want some return. So all these investors, there will be consumers. We want good products, but we also like low prices. There will be employees and supply chains. So all these people are what you could say stakeholders, and society at large is also, you could say, a stakeholder for companies. And some would even argue that the planet is a stakeholder. And an example of these kind of the tension between stakeholders is British Petroleum, which a few years ago wanted to go more into renewable energy, but went back to oil and gas because of their shareholders. They said, well, if you're going into energy, we will not get so much return on our investments, so please go back to oil and gas because that gives us more return on investment. But then the question of how the planet is a stakeholder. Because who has power? I mean, the shareholders certainly have power. They will go to the shareholder meetings and so on. The banks might also have some power. Consumers will say, we're not going to buy the products if we don't get what we want. Employees can leave the company. But the planet is very silent. Does that planet have a voice at all? Not really. It's not a share or a stakeholder that is shouting very loudly into the boardrooms of the companies. So that's the, you could say, corporate strategy paradox. If we then look at, because companies have to look at sustainability, they have to make these sustainability reports, and some of them actually do quite happily do that. But there will always be resource constraints in companies. So how do we prioritize? I mean, do we prioritize environmental sustainability? Do we prioritize social sustainability? What is important for us? And I heard some time ago, I think it's about 1.5 years ago, maybe, I heard the sustainability manager from Novo Nordisk say, well, in our sustainability strategy, people come before the planet. We want to make sure that we can give insulin to people, and we know that we will have to build more manufacturing plants so that we can sell insulin, but people are more important than the planet. So they made a clear, you could say, priority. And you could also say that choosing as a company what you want to do also depends on what the public feels is most important. And sometimes we think about ourselves before we think about the planet. So it's not, you could say, maybe a big surprise that some companies are saying, well, we'll think about people instead of the planet. So we will look at the social sustainability, not necessarily, you could say, the environmental sustainability will be. And of course, I mean, there's also not just taking it at the local level, but you can also say, I mean, if you want to say, well, we have a production plant in a company, in a country with very low standards, so we'll close that, but that can then have detrimental impact on the people working there, because maybe they will not be able to keep up their livelihood because they lose their jobs, right? So it's not a simple decision necessarily from the company perspective. All right, so that was what you could call the strategic level of paradoxes from the company perspective. And then we have two left, which and the two in the middle, we call them stakeholder power, because who has the power to decide for the company what they do? Do they focus on profitability or sustainability? And when they decide to focus on sustainability, will it be social or environmental causes that they focus on? So these are, we then kind of go into the strategy level. And then even at the, you could say, operational level of organizations, there will be some things to think about as well, because you could also argue there's an environmental action paradox and maybe even a biodiversity action paradox. So what do you choose to do? So if we look at the environmental operational paradox, so will we focus on, if we decide we want to be environmental friendly, then the most talked about problem here is really climate. So should we focus on climate or biodiversity? Well, I mean, sustainability reporting is about climate change, pollution, water, biodiversity, resource use. And there's a huge tendency we can see within organizations or within businesses to have this climate myopia. I mean, there's been so much focus on climate for a very long time that is really where they focus. And that is one of the reasons is also that, in a way, I mean, you could argue for and against, and I've talked to people that say, well, biodiversity is not more complex than climate, but at least we don't have one measure for biodiversity right now. We have one measure for climate. I mean, CO2 emissions, and that is something that is, we can say, well, are we going up or are we going down? What we can set the goals. We will have, I don't know, reduced our CO2 emissions by 2030 and so on. So it's in a way also easier for companies to work with. And you can also look at the Danish tripartite, where they say, well, what's the focus there? Well, we will focus on reducing CO2 emissions. We have the CO2 taxes. We will focus on water. What about biodiversity? I mean, where did that go? So it's not unusual that that firms also look, you could say, towards society at large on how will they focus. And then we can also talk about what we call the biodiversity action paradox. And I put a few pictures in here, which you might not know, but within biodiversity action, and what we've been looking at also is because how do we see what companies are doing on biodiversity? Well, we can call them and talk to them. So a lot of the Danish companies are not very far in it. In doing things about biodiversity, of course, some are, but we've also looked at their sustainability reports. So what is it that they're reporting on? So what is it they want to communicate to their shareholders and to the general public about what they're doing about biodiversity? And one of the things that they talk about is, well, we have this global biodiversity framework that Marianne mentioned, IPBES. That's something that they put out. That's the bottom picture. But there's also what they call the mitigation hierarchy. And the mitigation hierarchy says that companies should first avoid making negative impact on, you could say, nature and biodiversity. Then if they cannot do that, cannot avoid totally, because of course, a lot of companies that have a high effect on biodiversity, they are either what we would call land use. So that would be the agricultural industry, agri-food industry that Rasmus was also talking about. Then there will also be extraction industries. That could be mines. It could be oil and gas. So these are really heavy on having an impact on biodiversity. So if they cannot avoid, I mean, as a farmer, you probably cannot avoid using land if you want to grow food. And if you're in the mining industry, you cannot avoid to make, I mean, impact it, because you need to get some of the stuff that you need to extract from the land. So if you cannot avoid everything, at least you can minimize. And if you cannot minimize, then you can restore so that you put it back to maybe after you did build a road in the Amazon, you could take it away again. You probably won't do that, but at least you can restore things around it. And when you have done all you can to do that, then you can start offsetting, or you could say kind of compensating for the negative impact you've had. But what do we do? I mean, what we can see from the ESG reports is that it's very, very difficult for companies to totally avoid, and they will rather talk about offsetting and buying or having a fund and investing in you could say maybe even pollinators, because they think that that's a good idea, doing that. But there are some things that they can do. There is the science-based targets for nature, where they can see, so what are the things we can do, and follow some guidelines on what can be done. So I'd like to end kind of with a small example, and it's just and you could say a little bit what we would call anecdotal evidence, because it's from talking to a Danish company, just to illustrate how this paradox, or how these nested paradoxes play out for companies. So it's a renewable energy company. You can kind of see that from the picture, and they wanted to start a biodiversity strategy. So that was kind of their idea, and I had some discussions with them, because they said, well, of course they're in the you could say in the business of land use, right? Because they want to make these solar farms, as we call them, or so put these solar panels on existing land, and this land could either have been probably most of it, or sometimes it's been used for farming before. But it can also be land that has been privately owned, often it's close to villages or small towns. And they wanted this biodiversity strategy because they said, well, biodiversity seems to be important for people living around the new solar plants. So that in this area, in the reporting, you would say, well, there are some reputational risks, right? So the company would risk getting a bad reputation if they don't really think about biodiversity. And of course, we could argue, are these people really interested in biodiversity, or are they just finding good arguments for not wanting to live beside a solar plant? But they at least hear the word biodiversity often when they go out and talk to people when talking about places to have these solar plants. And then they went into a discussion with a consultant, where the consultant was, I think, she was actually using the biodiversity map that Rasmus also showed us, and said, well, one thing, if you want to make a biodiversity strategy, what you could do is you could avoid areas with high nature value, where the bioscore is high, where these species, red listed species that are that might go extinct, where they are, and of course we have right now the biodiversity map where the species are now, but there's another map where they're saying, okay, so if we wanted to have 30% protected nature in Denmark, where would that be? And then the consultant said to them, well, you just have to avoid, I mean, a good biodiversity strategy would be to avoid these areas. And the management team were like, yeah, but there are so few areas that we can potentially put these solar plants in. So if we totally avoid these areas, and maybe also avoid, I don't know, being in the vicinity, so being close to these areas, it will be very difficult for us to put up solar plants. And that is what we are here for. That's putting up solar plants. So the decision not to be in areas of high bioscore, or at least close to, would really limit the business potential. So just to illustrate that they might want to have a biodiversity strategy, but once they understand what you could say, consequences are of doing things, they might think twice, because then they will not be able to do what they are set into the world for, and that's what they understand is making these new solar plants. And you can also say that I think the company went into this idea of making a biodiversity strategy because they thought, well, we are one of the good ones because we are making renewable energy. And of course, from a climate perspective, that is very important. But from a biodiversity perspective, it's not necessarily that useful. So that was actually also all I had planned for my talk.
Thank you very much, Helle, for a very good presentation on the nested paradoxes of incorporating biodiversity in businesses. Very interesting. We have time for a few questions. If anyone have something urgent now, otherwise we'll return. Marianne, you have a question?
Thank you very much, Helle. That was really fascinating. I wonder, in your research, have you come across that family-owned or family-influenced companies? They might have more long-term strategies, and therefore also considering sustainability, resilience in a different way.
I understand where you come from, and I think it's a very good question. We haven't right now. What we have been looking at is from the sustainability reports and the annual reports. We've been looking at the 50 largest European companies because they have had to report, even though that the omnibus has kind of played down the role of reporting. So we haven't really looked at, and they are not really family owned. But you have a really good point, but that would also only be anecdotal evidence that I think there is a tendency for these family owned to think, and I think what they do is they think they have a longer time perspective, right? So they actually go into some of the areas so they go away from the instrumental value of nature into, well, we and our generations to come will want there still to be nature, but it's a really good point, and I think we should probably look more into that. So yeah, thanks for keeping that in my mind. Yeah.
Rasmus, you have a question as well?
Yeah, I'd like to know, do you see a competition for labor aspect, so that you need to, in order to extract qualified labor, you need to be sustainable, for instance, because sustainability is a high priority agenda for many young people?
Yes, we haven't looked into that. I mean, what I find in a way more interesting from the labor, but I do think, well, I'll answer. I think young people think more about where they work than, because there's also so little unemployment. So I think young people think more about where they work, and they make really very thought through decisions on where they work, but of course not all of them will do that. But what I think from a labor perspective, what I think is really interesting is, how do these companies actually get the knowledge necessary for them to make biodiversity strategies? And that's a totally different question. But I mean, because usually, if depending on the industry you're in, or I would say almost in all industries, you know nothing about biodiversity. So you need that knowledge from somewhere else. And the example I gave, they got it from a consultancy, but I've seen very few firms actually hiring people, biologists in. I know Novo Nordisk did it at some point, but then they fired them again when the geopolitical situation changed. But where are they getting that knowledge from? But so I do think some people, but I have to say now, I'm at the business school and I teach business students, and not all of them think very much about where they want to work. So not for all of them. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Helle. I was maybe you can't answer this, but I was thinking a little bit about, do you have any insight into the amount of money or investments companies in in Europe or in Denmark have invested in activities that go in the direction of incorporating biodiversity somehow.
No, but I can see that when we look at the ESG reports, what they really do is they say we have set up we've set up a fund where we want to invest in. Some of them do that. Some of them say we have set up a fund where we want to invest in nature restoration. And the big ones do that. We also have good examples of that from Denmark. We have Hempelfonden, which has invested. We have so private funds, and we have the best. That's called Heart. No, what is it called? But Bestseller has also made a fund where they're investing. Marianne, did you know?
I think it's called Heartland.
Heartland, yes, exactly. Not just Heart, but it is, it's called Heartland. So
the festival,
exactly. Yeah. So not the festival, but also so some big companies are making these funds where they're investing in conservation and restoration, but I haven't looked at the you could say the total amount. How much are they doing it? But they're doing it in Denmark, and they're also doing it in Europe. We can see that.
Thank you. So we will proceed with the last speaker of this webinar that we expanded to 4 speakers because there's so many interesting angles of this, and I'm very happy to welcome Rosalind McCann, professor in Sustainable Communities at Department of Environmental and Society at Utah State University in the US, but at the moment a guest researcher at Aarhus University in the arts faculties, which is humanities and education. And Rosalind, you promised to enlighten us more on sort of the social science perspective of how we could foster behavioral change in people, and maybe more specifically in people active in agriculture or systems that uses land and biology. Okay, I will stop sharing and you can start.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the presenters before me. I've actually learned quite a bit, and Helle actually provided a great segue with a deeper dive now into the human dimensions elements of working to increase biodiversity. Humans are complex beings, so let's unravel some of the complexity and increase the likelihood of success of getting behavioral adoption when it comes to trying to increase biodiversity across and beyond Denmark. So let me go ahead and share my screen and see how this works. Okay. Perfect. Is that showing up?
It works.
Okay, so I am a social scientist. I've worked at Utah State since 2011, and my primary role is to work with communities to foster environmental behavior. And I apply theory and social marketing techniques to do so with a range of topics, including local food systems, our statewide farmers market network, to ecological design with the permaculture design framework. And so my background actually is in agriculture. I was a professor. I worked on a dairy farm and on a broiler farm as well, and as an agronomist assistant for a farmer's co-op. So what that meant is I would walk farmers' fields after they'd been sprayed with pesticides, primarily glyphosate, and I would see what the die-off had been of the weeds that were sprayed and recommend for the next spray schedule. And during that time, I started to seriously question our food system, which seemed like it was at war with nature instead of working with nature. And that really was a segue into a career around fostering environmental behaviors, so including land conservation, local food systems, and diversified agriculture, local as well as organic. So just a little bit of background there. In my master's, I took a deeper dive into the human dimensions element of this with a study that looked at the consumer awareness of organic versus conventional agriculture and different terminology used within both, like biotechnology, for example. And I was doing a local food tracking study at that time as well with grocery stores during our peak growing season to see, for example, with strawberries. This was all up in Canada where I grew up. And so when strawberries were in season, what percentage of grocery store strawberries were actually from Ontario growers? And but that was also discouraging to see that we were sourcing so much from the United States and other countries when we were producing so much in Canada, but just shipping it out. So it's just some dysfunctional elements of our food system. And then for my PhD, I went down to the US and was working with the Nature Conservancy and partnering with cattle ranchers. And I was looking at what factors predict the likelihood of adopting a conservation easement, so protecting your land from development. And that was a mixed method study where we did a statewide survey with ranchers, and then I also did a depth interviewing with ranchers across the state. And this was in Florida, which was at the time the largest calf-cow operating state in the United States. And that research involved a range of interesting factors, from riding on horseback with a cattle drive to in a swamp buggy to hunt for wild hogs on a rancher's property. So helping out and fully immersing in the research while I was conducting these interviews. And then from there, I worked in the national parks for a few years and ended up at Utah State. So that's just a bit of background of where I come from and my perspective when it comes to the agricultural sector and why I do what I do with environmental behaviors now. So what's going to happen in our presentation in our short time together is I want to explore how to connect with farmer value systems. And so how do we really bridge across our worlds and connect with the core values that we share? And also strategies of success from my experience with engaging in community and providing feedback to community members. And then lastly, this community-based social marketing used so often for fostering sustainable behavior. Turns out that there's some common factors that are used to get people to consume more in the marketing world that you can also use to get people to engage in sustainable behaviors. So we'll unravel some of that. Okay, so as we get started, let's take a deeper dive into the world of working with agriculturalists through an example of Denmark's Green Tripartite Agreement. So we're going to imagine two scenarios together. And as you hear these two scenarios, I want you to think about which scenario you feel is best and why. Okay, so here we go, Denmark's Green Tripartite Agreement. So this is dubbed the world's most aggressive climate policy for agriculture, as many of you already know. With the aim to convert agricultural land into nature, establishing 250,000 hectares of new forest and transforming 140,000 hectares of low-lying farmland into natural landscapes. So I'm involved in a small piece of this in my time here in Denmark with a afforestation project where we're looking at implementing 2 food forests and involving local communities in that work, one at Himmelberg Garden and the other in Lemby. So imagine you're one of the 23 local tripartite bodies established to ensure transformation of the landscape respects local conditions, and you're trying to get local farmers to sign on to engage with your biodiversity aims. You're about to call a local dairy farmer. You've got funding to help this farmer diversify the perennial species along a stream that runs through their property. Okay, so you're about to pick up the phone and call this dairy farmer. So I've got 2 scenarios for you. Here's scenario 1. Hello, Mr. or Mrs. Anderson. I'm Dr. Rosalind McCann from Aarhus University. We received funding under a biodiversity valorization grant, which would help to diversify the land along the stream banks flowing through your property. We are hoping to create a riparian corridor for migratory birds. Are you interested in working on this project with me? So just pause for a second and imagine that. And then we have scenario 2. So hello, Mr. or Mrs. Anderson. I was chatting with Christian down the road from you and he shared your number. I'm Roz McCann and I work with farmers as part of my research at Aarhus University. I grew up working on a dairy farm where we milked 60 to 100 cows, 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. every day. Is now a good time to talk, or is there a better day or time this week for me to call or stop by? Okay, great. I've received funds to purchase plants and hire student interns to help farmers plant trees on their properties. Doing so would help you qualify for the Danish biodiversity subsidy. So just imagine that existed, and maybe it does, and I'm not aware. We would work with you on submitting the application for this study, doing the bulk of the paperwork. Is this something you'd be willing to meet with me and discuss in further detail? I can come to you or meet you at a local coffee shop, whichever is better. Okay, so with that, you're probably thinking about the scenarios. Any thoughts on which scenario might increase the likelihood that that farmer would actually take the next step and say, yes, let's have a conversation? And you can put it in the chat or unmute yourself, either way.
I would go for number 2. It's personalized. You identify with the farmer, understand his situation, even offer to take out what farmer doesn't like, all the bureaucracy. So
perfect, thank you. The answer I was hoping that someone might say. So yes, scenario 2 is the one that is more likely, in my experience, to increase success. And so the reason for that is commonality was discussed. It was established. There was a respect established for their time. There's no jargon in the terminology, and so academic jargon is cut out, and it speaks to the benefits directly that the farmer might see. And so those are some factors that will increase the likelihood of success. So we'll take a deeper dive here in a second. Did someone have their hand up? I'm not sure if I missed that or yeah, Rasmus, go ahead.
I did that. I would say maybe number 1. So I attended a meeting with Arla lately, and there was one of the largest dairy farmers in Arla attending the meeting, and we were discussing green tripartite solutions at that meeting and investments. And at the end of the meeting, he approached me and said, this was so lovely that he actually got some scientific insight in what biodiversity was and what was the preconditions for biodiversity. He really missed that in all these discussions about the green tripartite. So he would love to have an excursion where I could come and inform all his colleagues about what is really up and down in the discussions about biodiversity, because they need to know the scientific matters and not just to drink coffee and have talks and conversations.
Yes, of course, there are scenarios where that first scenario would be successful, and there are examples. And so thank you for that insight. It's not so black and white. And so we'll unveil some reasons why overall a strategy like scenario 2 would be more successful. So let's imagine that you are going to go ahead and do this type of project where you're working to increase biodiversity on farmland. So my recommendation is that, first of all, we would begin with a community gathering. And this really will set the baseline for increasing community interest around the topic and a social norm that this is something the community cares about. And with that community conversation, when you're hosting that type of event, I recommend first getting a local cheerleader or community member that's respected by the community to help bring people into the conversation. Of course, providing food and coffee. The Danes seem really good at knowing how to do this at their events. And briefly overview the aim and why you've brought them in when the community is there. And that you're seeking community input. And you could seek community input around a topic, for example, of what types of perennial plants grew here historically, and what perennials would they like to see more of. And you could divide them into small groups and have them present back to everyone what they came up with in their small groups. And then one option could be, so this is an example from a permaculture workshop that I taught back last spring in Moab, Utah. So here we have participants sharing back their findings to the class, and we also behind them have post-its, which is another strategy where each table could have post-its writing different types of functions that they want to see this type of space provide. And then they get grouped together by theme on a wall, and then participants can rank by sticker, different color stickers of first, second, third choice of priority. And then that helps you as a researcher know what you should do as your next steps based on what the community sees as their priorities. So of course, this is all my experience is from a US context, but hopefully some of these techniques would work as well in a Danish context. Okay, so with that community conversation, it's extremely important that you turn around and provide feedback of what they said at the event. So ideally, if you're hosting an event, you are tracking attendance of who comes to that event, and you're doing so through some sort of a sign-up sheet. What I recommend is that the facilitators, the people running the event, complete the sign-up sheet first. And it's kind of like when you walk by a store and nobody's in it, you're less likely to go in because you don't want to deal with having to talk to the staff or something because you're the only person in the store. So you maybe would stage, if you ran that store, someone in the store looking like they're shopping so that more people walking by are likely to come in. This is the social norm influence. And so if you already write your information on the sign-up sheet, you are setting an example of what you want participants to do, but also you're more importantly establishing the social norm of signing up on the sheet. So pass that around, and then you have the contact info of participants for feedback. And it can also help you with your impact tracking, so you're not trying to present and also track how many people are in the room. And then you might even include some sort of workshop rating question of how well was the workshop conducted, or whatever you want to ask. So then for a turnaround time, I try to turn around this feedback within a week to participants. And this isn't peer-reviewed publication that's come out of this event. It's here's what you said, here's what we're going to do next as a result. So clear statements, avoiding academic jargon. And then ideally, as well when you want to host the next meeting and the date and time for that, if there's a next meeting to occur. And then you ideally, this feedback type is a one-page sheet, front and back, graphically appealing. And here's an example of what that could look like. So this is from a climate change study I conducted the last several years on the Navajo Nation. That is one page front and back, and includes what is the study, what's the main objective, and then the results are organized by theme with a main support quote or two underneath that theme directly from the words of participants. So instead of me telling them, here's the main points of what you said, I'll summarize the theme, and then the words are actually their words that highlight the main points. So that's just an example to give you better perspective of what it is I'm talking about here. Okay, so so let's imagine that you're then coming back and you're conducting another community meeting. So based on what participants said, you've gone out and you've obtained grant funds, and you're looking at working with local farmers to increase their biodiversity. And so what I do next is, this is tied in with the community-based social marketing framework that Doug Mackenzie Moore really coined and pulled together different research and theories around social persuasion, diffusion of innovations, etc. And so one of the first steps, once you've selected your behavior, you've done research on the impact of that behavior that you've selected, then you do what's called a barrier benefit analysis. And ideally, I like to do this with the people I'm working with, so the community, and more specifically in this example with farmers. And so you look at your target behavior, which is increasing biodiversity, maybe planting diverse tree species along a stream corridor on that dairy farmer's property. And then you have the current behavior, which is where cows are maybe grazing right up to the stream system. And so from the perspective of the farmer, rancher, etc., with increasing biodiversity on their property, what might they perceive as barriers to that So we heard some actually in previous presentations today. Some barriers are that then you take that land out of production potentially, and it's not producing a crop anymore, or it's producing a different crop if it's a perennial that is growing food. And then there's some perceived benefits as well, of course. So maybe it's going to make that farmer eligible for some sort of subsidy available to them, and also positive public relations. And that's been something I've seen in the news here, that many farmers are a little disgruntled about how they're portrayed in the media, right, when it comes to efforts to diversify the land. And so then you have the current behavior, and let's say it's cows grazing up to the stream corridor. Barriers include it's detrimental to the stream system, and whatever might come out of the perception of the farmer. And then the benefits are that it's easy, they don't have to change anything, etc. And so you want to unravel what these barriers and benefits are. And then you design your whole campaign around increasing the benefits of your target behavior, decreasing the barriers of that target behavior. And you want to do that by making it as easy, convenient as possible. So if a big barrier is they can't afford to buy the plants to plant in their landscape, you obtain grant funding to plant those plants, or they don't have the time to do that, then you get student interns to help put those plants in the ground. And then for the current behavior, you want to, as best as possible, play up all of the reasons why that current behavior is not great. And whether it's a time waster for the farmer or it's negative PR, whatever it is, you want to play those up. And then the perceived benefits of the current behavior, overall, we tend to just try to ignore those in our approach. So we don't want to play up, of course, the benefits of what it is they're currently doing when we are hoping they'll change and engage in the target behavior. And I'm going to be going pretty quick through this to make sure we still end on time. So with that, we then go into the community-based social marketing framework. Norms are front and center because despite what human beings say, we are highly influenced by social norms. We are herd animals mentally. We are highly influenced by what other people in front of us do. Like if someone picks up trash, we're much more likely, statistically, research shows, to do the same thing. And then the other social marketing tools include incentives, commitment, communication, convenience, and prompts. So I'm just going to give a couple examples of how this could each work in our dairy farmer example to increase biodiversity. Okay, so with social norms, a couple things that could be done in this example scenario include securing a handful of early adopters to serve as models so that other farmers can see, oh, this farmer who looks similar to me in what they do with their production have already started this process. And that provides a lot of reinsurance. So find who those early adopters are through your networks and reaching out. You can also create a campaign around stoking community pride. And so if this farmer is based in Lenvi, for example, you could start a campaign of Lenvi proud, and I'll give an example in just a second on the next slide. And this really helps shifting the original perception of, oh, this is more regulatory burden on me, to this is something that we're proud of as a community, that we stand for as a community. I did this back in the US. In Moab, there were concerns. We were putting in pollinator gardens, and there were concerns about potential bee stings and et cetera with the bees in these ecologically diverse spaces. And in the end, we held a pollinator party, which brought in kids from each grade level in the school, presented different plays and skits around pollinators, and parents came to watch them. They adopted all the plants we wanted to plant in the garden at that event, and it became a sense of pride, celebrating our local bees instead of a sense of fear. And so that was there's a lot to unravel of that example, but just a quick example on how to turn something that might be perceived as a burden or as negative into a sense of pride. And so here's an example of that. And I use DeepL Translate for this. So bear with me if there's some mistakes in the Danish, which is why I still have the English here. But Lenvi proud. Lenvi is leading the way in Denmark when it comes to biodiversity, thanks to our local farmers and caring community. And so you could have some sort of a signage or advertising campaign in the local newspaper, and signage in town that's really showing this is something that the community is engaged with, and they start to see themselves as we're a community that stands for this issue. Okay, incentives, a couple examples. Of course, this isn't just giving money to the farmer, but making it easier for them. So picking out the plants based on the community input and the farmer input, and purchasing those plants, getting students to, student volunteers or interns to help plant those plants. There's also incentives around, it's not that they're just giving up land in production. Perennials provide a lot of different functions, and our perennial spaces that we have been working on in Utah are growing a lot of food that's donated to students in need on campus, several hundred pounds of food in these garden spaces that are perennial, primarily perennial. And so what benefits could be reaped? I went to a site in Denmark, a permaculture site that was growing a diversified food forest with little plant guild experiments. One was walnut interplanted with pawpaw, which I was really excited to see pawpaw in Denmark. But so that's an example where they're going to harvest from that space, and they're growing a few different diverse perennial species. Okay, and then also incentives could include things like qualifying for subsidies. Okay, commitment is a really interesting one. There's a couple techniques with commitment. You could have what's called foot in the door or door in the face. And so foot in the door commitment is where you come to a farmer with a small ask, potentially, whether they'd be willing to put up a sign or something supporting pollinators or whatever that might be. And then you come back with a bigger ask of them to fully engage in this biodiversity project. So that's a foot in the door. Door in the face is when you come with a bigger ask. I use this one much less, but you come with a big ask, and then knowing you're probably going to get turned down, and then you come back with a smaller ask, knowing that they likely feel guilty about turning down that big ask and are likely to say yes on the second ask. So two different strategies there, primarily with commitment. And then communication is really clearly communicating the what's in it for me for the farmer to do this type of thing. And of course, there's benefits like positive public relations and communicating what that the farmers in the area are engaging in this biodiversity project. What's interesting about the positive PR piece, if this is published, one, it makes the farmer proud that they have some positive PR published about them, but then also it increases their commitment, because now they know that the public has read that they're going to do this, and they feel committed then to having to do it. So it increases the obligation that they're going to do it, and it also increases the social norm that the community is starting to increase their engagement in biodiversity projects. Okay, just a couple more, and then I'll wrap up and keep us on time, hopefully. So convenience is huge when it comes to working with people. So this is getting to decreasing the perceived barriers of the behavioral adoption. So this is, again, going back to students or others helping to plant these species on the property. It could also be teaching the farmer directly, how do you track the changes that you're observing through your biodiversity project? And so showing them hands-on. This is going back to like a lot of farmers are interested in the science behind some of this and how to do this. And so teaching them how to track that and making it easy as possible. And lastly, we have prompts. So prompts could include something like signage at the front of a farm that is celebrating biodiversity. So this is in German, but showing that this is a farm that's supporting biodiverse species, really insect health, pollinators, etc. But you could have something like this in Denmark that's like a certified site for biodiversity. So you're making an potentially invisible behavior of increased trees somewhere on the property very visible at the front of the property through this signage, where then it's just increasing the social norm, and that this is something that other farmers are doing by this common branding. Okay, so if the big takeaways from what I've just gone over is connect with values. It's extremely important. Avoid jargon. If you have commonalities of also working in agriculture or living in the community or knowing people that live in the community, really capitalize on those as your points of commonality in a conversation. And meet at a convenient place for that farmer or agriculturalist, and so at their community or coffee shop or at their farm directly. Favor in-person communication, it's always best, and offer to help while talking. That's another tip, way to connect to values. And engage the community in what it is you're doing. So host a visioning session, host something like a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats session, if that makes sense, a barrier benefit analysis, get contact information and summarize each meeting and provide feedback to contacts within a week, ideally. And then apply something like the community-based social marketing framework with the different marketing tools that will increase your success. I'm a minute over, but those are the main points from my experience of working with agriculturalists and how to increase the likelihood of behavioral adoption. So with that, I'll pass it back.
Thank you, Rosalind, for a very interesting talk. I think we have until 12:30 for the webinar. If there are any immediate questions for Rosalind, I think we should take that first, and then I'll just like to have a little bit of a common discussion, and also people with questions to previous points can raise those. I was thinking, Rosalind, that a lot of these, I mean, the norms and incentives and commitment, communication, convenience, and prompt, they would be sort of generally relevant to any kind of transition where you have stakeholders to act somehow different. Would there be any specific things around increasing the amount, the biodiversity in farming management systems, or biodiversity related changes that you see particularly important in when talking about these incentives? If you understand the question.
Yeah, I believe so. So which of those marketing tools might be most beneficial when it comes to
biodiversity and this specific topic? Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely think making an invisible behavior visible is extremely important. So not that planting trees is completely invisible, but a lot of these farms are large and the public might have no idea that anything different is happening. And so celebrating that the farmer is doing something positive is something that will make that farmer proud and more engaged in the project. So I think that's a definite huge one, which includes the positive public relations in the local newspaper or whatever outlet makes the most sense. And the social norms is, I think, the best gateway into this type of work, of making sure you have one or two farmers that you can work with. So maybe it's that farmer that was at the event who was excited about the biodiversity conversation, getting their contact info, and maybe they're one of your early adopters. So you can show pictures of another farm or a video of another farmer doing this work in Denmark, and then that farmer, the other farmer you're working with, says, oh, that person looks like me and is doing similar things as me, and they believe in this, so maybe I should give it a consideration. So I'd say those, the social norm and the uplifting of the behavior through making it visible,
so visualization of the effect and or how it would look like. And yeah, okay, thanks. Helle, you have a question, and then Rasmus.
Yeah, it was more a comment because due to Rosalind's kind of what would maybe be more important, but I know, and that's of course not from a farmer perspective, but I know from a company perspective. I mean, we talked very much about greenwashing, right? Where companies and are talking about stuff which doesn't really make sense from either a climate, but specifically a biodiversity perspective. But there's also quite a lot of companies that have started doing green hushing because they are not sure that what they're doing is right, is good enough. So they would rather not talk about it. So I think it's a little bit maybe contra. I understand that from a local community perspective, it's maybe really, really important for the rest of the community that they are clear about it. But there are actually companies that are saying, well, let's not go out and publish this in the local newspaper because we're not sure that this is really, I mean, we're not sure it's bulletproof. So they get a little bit afraid. Just something to think about.
That's true. There
so
could
it's
be
the fear of being called greenwashing activity.
Yeah.
I've not heard that term, green hushing. I'm going to have to write that down and unpack that a little after this talk.
So some call it brown washing, but I don't like that term. I think green hushing is is better.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. Green hushing.
Rasmus? You're muted.
Thanks. If we are entirely focused on having success in starting a dialogue or convincing a farmer to be proactive or contribute to a common target, how important is it that this target is actually correct? So for the Danish tripartite, we are a lot of biologists that are actually warning against planting trees, because planting trees will usually create shade that is detrimental to biodiversity in a part of the world where it's not necessary to plant trees, because trees will actually come by themselves, and that will create a much more sort of hospitable environment for all other species, because there'll be openings and light coming in, and I guess we have a bit of the same problem with grazing, that for decades we have used agricultural subsidies to graze for conservation purposes, but they have been used in a way that they have given incentives to do summer grazing at very high stock levels, density levels of animals, and that has led to overgrazing and actually had detrimental. So I would, as a farmer, if I engaged in such activities, I would be very disappointed if biodiversity experts came afterwards and said, well, that's nice, but you actually destroyed biodiversity, sorry to say.
Yeah, this is complicated, and it is extremely important to decrease as many of the complications of implementing the behavior as possible, so the farmer hasn't then committed a big amount of money and time to this effort that potentially will fail, quote unquote, in the end. But I would pass it to the other speakers to answer that first question, because that's not something that I can answer as a social scientist, but about what if this effort fails. Your thoughts on that first framing of that question, the other speakers?
Well, I think it really also depends on what the impact of realizing that it has failed. Because if we always go for perfection, it's a lot of trial and error. And you also said, or Rasmus, that farmers and generally, we need to know more about what works, what is biodiversity as the first thing, and what works and the context, and what kind of biodiversity are you going for, and what is close by. That if you do something wrong, then you can change tack too, right? As long as you don't destroy something that was really very valuable, then I think that's another matter. But if you kind of start with a field where there's not a lot of biodiversity, how wrong can it actually go? Could be a counter question, compared to actually doing something and getting more awareness and learnings.
And farmers are intelligent. I mean, this is an opportunity to be transparent with them about that exact thing of, hey, we're still figuring some of this out, but we have funds to do this experiment. Are you willing to try this with us? And just being honest about that is like, it might not be the be all end all. And I think that humility goes a long way as well. Many of us academics could use more of course.
So I think honesty is a key word here. So let's be honest and admit that that the goals of the green tripartite they are not about biodiversity. The goals, the political goals set and the methods chosen in the green tripartite, they're about reducing nitrogen leaching to our marine waters and about climate mitigation. So that's what the goals are about. If they were about biodiversity, we would have made different choices, definitely. We would have gone for increased protection of areas of high conservation value, increased restoration of areas of high conservation value, because they are actually declining in biodiversity because of lack of conservation and lack of restoration. So that would have been the most cost-effective approaches to biodiversity in Denmark, but those were not taken. So let's admit that afforestation is not about biodiversity; it's about protecting against leaching, and that would be the honest way of going about this.
Very
Can I
helpful.
also comment on that, because I think our you could say average farmer is also in one way or the other seeing some of the paradoxes that I talked about, right? Because there's a lot of policy going on, and there's all these subsidies which are not in favor of, as Rasmus is saying, biodiversity. And then there's the tripartite, that's also not for biodiversity. So they are all the time faced with decisions being made, and they're not necessarily they can't even depend on the help they're getting from the local consultancy. What are they called? The farming consultancies, because they don't know either about biodiversity. So there's so much lack of knowledge about biodiversity, especially when you then talk about water and climate and so on. So they end up actually finding it really hard to make the right decisions. And I in a way, I don't blame them. So I think we really need to understand that this is not that it's also sometimes the local farmer who's, I mean, even though you say, Rosalind, they're not stupid, but they sometimes sound and seem stupid. But it's not only that; it's also the whole system that they are working in. And some really want to do well and want to make the right decisions, but find it really difficult to get through and to understand what's really going on.
Yeah, that's fair.
May I ask, where do you see organic farming in relation to biodiversity compared to conventional farming?
To me.
Well, to all.
Yeah,
I would say that.
What kind of biodiversity you talk about? Is it soil biodiversity or, yeah, but I would like to hear your view on this, on biodiversity and organic farming.
So from a biodiversity point of view, I think there are meta-studies out there, several actually, that shows that on average, organic farming provides sort of habitat for 30% more species than conventional farming. So there is a significant difference between the two. And that should then be balanced against the increased need of space for producing the same amount of food in organic farming. So that's sort of, you gain a bit and you lose a bit. So that depends really on your political preferences regarding the amount of biodiversity present in the farmed landscape. So if you look on the amount of biodiversity present in the state or in the region, then the farmland is almost negligible. It doesn't make a difference, because this small increase in biodiversity, that can create a more nice landscape and a more living field, but it does not really change the conditions for rare or threatened or endangered species in Denmark, and we have thousands of those.
And what about soil biodiversity? Because that's one that we don't talk so much about, right?
I would say the same.
Anders, you have a hand?
Yeah, I agree with Rasmus, what he says. Maybe microbial diversity will increase somewhat in organic farming system. But anyway, so I was just wondering about we are focusing a lot on terrestrial biodiversity, but is it so that the green tripod would actually increase the marine biodiversity, by decreasing the outlet of nitrogen to coastal zones and so on?
I think that's a reasonable claim. And I think in order to be cost efficient or just efficient with regard to the marine environment, I think the reduced leaching and nutrient pollution should definitely be combined with reduced fisheries, especially destroying the sea bottom. Because if you just continue destroying with physical destruction of the marine environment, I don't think you will get that increase in biodiversity at the end of the day. So you would need to have more sustainable fisheries combined with the reduction in leaching.
Other comments to that? Yeah, Rosalind?
Oh, I just wanted to mention about the soil biodiversity. So I say scale has, in my experience, been extremely important here. So I went on a regenerative farm tour in Finland, Sweden, and in Denmark, and really the smaller scale market permaculture, plant guild type gardens, regenerative spaces, like Alnarp's agroecology farm over in Malmo, Sweden, for example. There was a handful in Finland as well that are applying really experimental interplanting of species, looking at the way plants are supporting each other and soil microbiodiversity. But then also the composting techniques they were applying were extremely interesting and like bokashi composting, worm teas, etc., applying to their crops to boost the microbial activity in the soil. And so, but those were all when you look at agriculture as a whole, the smaller scale of farms. So I've not seen this on a large scale be successful. Not to say it's not, I just don't have an example personally from that. And the ecological gardens that I helped spearhead in Utah have been primarily in urban spaces, so transitioning either concrete, like parking lots, into ecological gardens, or smaller pocket spaces in urban areas into a diversified planting that then is also food producing and pollinator attracting and nitrogen fixing, nutrient accumulating. And so I'm really interested in scale, and I'm scared almost to look deeply into the larger scale because I think I might be a little discouraged.
Yes, scaling is a well-known issue that we also have a lot of challenges with in the technical bioeconomy research, I can say. Thank you so much, all four speakers. I'll just try to wrap up so we'll end in time, and I think the discussion and your input and discussion have been very fruitful. I think I think it's clear that this increase of the knowledge base, both what we were going for in the first place, knowledge base of researchers that can add biodiversity thoughts to their research and development in bioeconomy, but also the knowledge base for farmers and citizens in general is really important if we are to do something about this. That's, I think, clear for me now. And then I think also in terms of that the series of webinars, we have heard several times that we should not overestimate the impact that more biodiversity in agricultural or production systems, I mean, that impact is somewhat limited to the greater challenge of biodiversity crisis. I think that is much more clear in my head. So I see sort of two dimensions of how to couple biodiversity in novel bioeconomy. One is sort of decreasing pressure on biodiversity. So in the agricultural system, that is just decreasing the pressure, not solving the problem necessarily, as I understand it. But perhaps another way of looking at it is really decreasing pressure on land use. So technologies or production systems that dramatically reduce the land use requirement so we could create space for protected biodiversity. Perhaps that's a more efficient way to go about it. But those are some thoughts I took from this, and I hope that we continue the contact and perhaps something good spins out of these discussions. So thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.